Rain pounded against the windows of Innovatec, muffling the chaos brewing at the heart of the company. 15 of the country's top engineers were on the verge of giving up, staring down what seemed like an impossible problem. "No one can trace this variable? That's impossible!" Dr. Benjamin Carter barked, his voice full of frustration. And while the clock kept ticking, a silent cleaning lady watched from the shadows. Whispering to herself, she muttered, "They're staring at the end and ignoring the beginning." In just 30 seconds, she'd do what everyone thought was impossible. But what happened next will leave you speechless. Curious? Drop a comment, hit that subscribe button, and share this inspiring story. The day broke under a cloud-covered sky, as if even the weather had given up on Innovatec. The glass building reflected nothing but dull shades of grey, and inside, the atmosphere was even heavier. The critical error wasn't just a glitch, it was an imminent collapse. Billions were at stake if the system wasn't fixed before the global launch, just 3 days away. Shareholders were pressing, investors were threatening, and the CEO was watching. Dr. Benjamin Carter, sleeves rolled up and tie loosened, paced in circles in the center of the control room. His bloodshot eyes told the story of sleepless nights and shattered pride. "This doesn't make sense. It makes no damn sense," he repeated, slamming his hands against the console. His team of engineers, brilliant but exhausted, typed furiously, hunting through lines of code like they were diving for a needle in a digital ocean. But the system remained broken. Each engineer in that room was considered a legend in their field. PhDs, awards, magazine covers. But none of it seemed to matter now. With every failed attempt, a heavy silence took over. The kind that carries fear, the fear of public failure, the fear of losing everything they built. It was the kind of crisis that didn't just expose weaknesses in the system, it laid bare the fragility of egos. Upstairs, on the top floor, Richard Sterling watched it all unfold, his brow furrowed. Tall, commanding, hands clasped behind his back. He stared at the monitors like a general surveying a battlefield. Known for his visionary mind and his ruthless demeanor, the CEO looked different that morning. Not just frustrated, disappointed. In his team, in the results, in himself. Meanwhile, Eleanor was pushing her cleaning cart down the hallway like she did every day. But today, her heart was racing. The tension in the air was electric, like the buzz before a thunderstorm. She felt it in the engineers' hurried steps, in their muffled shouting, in the slamming doors. But more than that, she saw it. She saw the missing logic in their projections. She saw the flaws hiding in plain sight. She saw what no one else seemed to notice. During a quiet break, she sat alone in the empty cafeteria. She pulled an apple from her dented lunchbox and stared at it, thoughtful. 15 brilliant minds, and not one of them can stop and see the basics, she whispered. A flash of memory hit her. 14 years old, sitting in a makeshift workshop with her dad, solving a circuit puzzle with a paperclip and a smile on her face. The longing hit her like a punch to the chest. While Eleanor drifted through her past, Benjamin was melting down again. "It's the team's fault," he shouted, pointing at one of the younger engineers. "You're wasting time on assumptions." Sarah, the youngest of them all, swallowed hard. It was the 3rd time that morning he'd humiliated her. Tears welled in her eyes, but she stayed quiet, burying her face in the monitor, trying to hide the pain and the fear of being the next to get fired. Down the hallway, Eleanor heard it all. But what she felt wasn't just empathy, it was outrage. She'd been belittled plenty of times for wearing a janitor's uniform, but she knew exactly what it was like to have talent trapped behind an appearance people love to judge. She sighed, closed her eyes, and whispered under her breath, "They're running in circles," and leaving the answer right there, in the center. As lines of code kept crashing, the engineers had no idea the solution was just a few steps away. Not in the screens, not in the software, but inside the mind of a woman they walked past every single day without noticing. Back in his office, Richard narrowed his eyes, catching a glimpse of Eleanor on the security feed. Something about her gave him a strange feeling, like she knew more than she let on, and though none of them realized it yet, Richard, Benjamin, and Eleanor, they were about to be pulled into a storm that would change their lives forever. Because that afternoon, Eleanor would make a move no one saw coming. And what happened next became a true, unbelievable story. The sky was just starting to lighten when Eleanor Vance stepped into the building for another day of work. The hallways were empty and quiet, as if the entire company was holding its breath. The scent of burnt coffee still lingered in the air, mixed with the metallic tang of overheated machines. While everyone else finally slept after another sleepless night, she was there, like always, invisible to some, but essential to everyone's fate. Her soft footsteps echoed between the cubicles. Every room, every workstation, was familiar territory. She knew where the hidden coffee stains were, the tangled cables no one ever bothered to fix, the whiteboards scribbled all the way to the edges. But what nobody knew was that she understood every line of code sketched across those boards, and that sometimes she'd quietly correct an equation with her cloth right before erasing it completely. While cleaning one of the smaller rooms, she stopped in front of an abandoned whiteboard in the corner. It showed a half-finished equation, like someone had simply given up. Eleanor stepped closer, tilting her head. Her eyes traced each symbol carefully, and then, with a faint smile, she completed the equation in her mind. Linear logic flaw. "They're overcomplicating things," she whispered, but she didn't dare write it down. Yes, Eleanor was young, but her eyes carried the weight of someone who had seen too much, lived too much, lost too much. She had the quiet beauty of someone who never tried to stand out. Dark brown hair pulled into a practical bun, warm brown skin dotted with a few freckles, and an intense gaze that rarely wandered. Every feature told a story, and every silence hid a life no one there could have imagined. She kept cleaning, softly humming an old tune her father used to whistle while they worked in the backyard. It calmed her mind, and somehow it made the math flow easier. As if the melody's rhythm helped everything click into place. Somewhere behind her a door opened. No one noticed. The cleaning lady's song was just background noise to the geniuses drowning in their failures. While emptying trash bins in the main conference room, Eleanor overheard a heated discussion between Benjamin and two engineers. She understood every word. The issue was a hidden security circuit no one had tested, assuming it was inactive. She knew that because that exact kind of failure had once led to tragedy in her past. But it wasn't time, not yet. They still didn't see her as someone worth listening to. Around noon, Eleanor passed Sarah in the hallway. The young engineer looked downcast, her eyes red from crying, holding a forgotten sandwich in her hand. They exchanged a brief glance. Eleanor offered a soft smile. "You just need to breathe and trust what you see." Sarah didn't quite understand, but something about that woman, her tone, her eyes, made her feel seen, as if Eleanor knew exactly what she was going through. A quiet thread connected them. Back in the main room, Benjamin was losing it. "We're not leaving until someone finds that missing variable," he shouted. But Eleanor knew it wasn't a variable. It was a logical sequence that needed to be retraced from the very beginning. As she scrubbed the floor near the central desk, she mentally noted every mistake, like she was cleaning the code right along with the grime, like she was preparing for the right moment. By the end of the day, as the others geared up for another long night of failed attempts, Eleanor remained alone in the dark room. She walked up to the large whiteboard and ran her fingers gently over the numbers. "They don't see it, but I do." She took a deep breath. Her eyes glowed with the certainty of someone who already knew the answer. and when no one was watching, she quietly drew a small symbol in the bottom corner of the board. Just a fragment of the solution, a test, a spark. Those engineers had no idea that the answer they were desperately hunting for had already been written by a cleaning lady with calloused hands and the mind of a genius, and the next day their world would change forever. On the fourth consecutive day of system failure, the Innovatech building pulsed like a living organism on the verge of collapse. Even the air felt heavier. On every floor, nervous whispers floated around. "They're talking layoffs. The CEO's furious. Are they going to cancel the launch?" But in the eye of the storm, no one seemed to notice Eleanor. No one, except Sarah. In the break room, Sarah sat trying to fight back tears with a crumpled napkin. Benjamin's cruel words still echoed in her mind. "You're just an intern with delusions of brilliance. Stay out of the way." Her face burned with shame. Her chest felt tight. When she heard footsteps approaching, she almost hid. But it was just Eleanor, with her bucket and cloth. Eleanor stopped, looked at her gently and silently handed her a clean tissue. Sarah took it like someone grabbing a lifeline. After a long pause, Eleanor finally spoke, her tone almost motherly. "The problem isn't you, it's his fear of watching you shine." Sarah looked at her, stunned. You heard what he said?" Eleanor gave a small smile. "I hear everything. Sometimes that's the only way to learn, in silence." And in that moment something shifted. For the first time, Sarah looked at Eleanor not as a janitor, but as someone who clearly didn't belong in the background. Meanwhile, Richard Sterling watched the team from above, as always. But that afternoon, his eyes followed Eleanor longer than he meant to. There was something magnetic about her, the way she moved so calmly through the storm, like she carried a compass inside her, always pointing toward the truth. It wasn't just curiosity, it was intuition, and Richard had always trusted his gut. Benjamin, on the other hand, was unraveling. His yelling grew louder, his tone sharper. He felt his authority slipping, not to someone above him, but to a quiet shadow beginning to emerge. He couldn't explain why, but he felt watched. With every glance from Sarah, every silence from Eleanor, his insecurity cracked wider. Later that evening, Eleanor was alone, mopping the floor in the conference room. Sarah walked by and hesitated. You really understand what's on that board, don't you?" she asked, pointing to the equations. Eleanor nodded slowly. "I understand more than I wish I did. Sometimes seeing too much feels like a curse." Sarah sat down against the wall. "Why don't you say anything?" Eleanor took a deep breath. "Because they told me my voice didn't matter. And I believed them. For a long time." As city lights flickered to life outside, Richard stepped off the elevator and walked across the empty floor. Turning the corner, he saw Eleanor and Sarah sitting on the floor, deep in conversation. The sight stopped him. Two women from completely different worlds, connected by something invisible and powerful. He didn't interrupt, but he made a mental note. He needed to know more about Eleanor Vance. In the days that followed, the pressure inside the company only intensified. The board demanded answers, deadlines were reshuffled by the hour, rumors of mass layoffs spread like wildfire. During a heated meeting, Benjamin even slammed the table, shouting, "Either we find the answer, or I hand in my badge myself." All of this, while no one knew, that the answer was already written, hidden, silent. Eleanor, now torn between loyalty to her silence and empathy for Sarah, began to falter. For the first time in years, she felt the urge to speak up, to step in, to make a difference. But fear was an old shadow. She knew what happened to those who dared to challenge the system. She'd paid that price once, and the weight of it still lingered in her chest. That night, alone in the janitor's room, Eleanor stared at her reflection in the glass. She saw an invisible woman, yes, but she also saw sparks in her eyes. Sparks she'd nearly forgotten were there. The time is coming, and I can't hide again. With that silent promise, she folded her cloth, slipped her notebook into her pocket, and braced herself. The next step would take more than courage. It would take everything she had tried so hard to bury. The day began heavy and suffocating, with thick clouds hanging low over the city. Inside Innovatec, the mood was even darker. The board had issued a final ultimatum. Either the failure was fixed by the end of the day, or the launch would be cancelled. The consequences were devastating. Stocks would crash, contracts would be broken, and hundreds would lose their jobs. You could feel the tension in the air, like the smell of ozone right before a lightning strike. In the conference room, Benjamin was more restless than ever. He paced back and forth, muttering numbers under his breath and shooting frustrated glares at the team. Sarah typed in silence, her shoulders tight, as if she were carrying the weight of failure alone. "This algorithm is sabotaging us, and I can't find where," Benjamin snapped. The engineers kept their heads down. They were exhausted and defeated. That's when Eleanor walked in. No fanfare, no rush, just a cloth in her hand and a strange spark in her eyes. At first no one noticed, as usual, but instead of cleaning, she stepped toward the whiteboard, where a faulty sequence blinked on the massive screen. She frowned, took a deep breath, and spoke. "This isn't a coding error. It's a misconfigured circuit in the core. You're staring at the mirror, not the reflection." Silence fell like a hammer, as if the whole world froze. Everyone turned to look at her. Benjamin raised his eyebrows, baffled. "Sorry, you're the janitor, right?" he said, smirking. Eleanor stood her ground. "I am, but I've also worked with similar systems before, and the error you're chasing is right here." She pointed to the bottom of the equation. Not in the math, but in the logic structure beneath the algorithm. The room burst into murmurs. Sarah jumped up. "Wait, that makes sense. I saw something like this in an old project." She rushed to the console, hands trembling as she typed. Benjamin tried to stop her. "We don't have time for guesses from amateurs." But at that exact moment, Richard Sterling walked in, drawn by the commotion, and said firmly, "Let her try." All eyes turned to Sarah as she followed Eleanor's guidance with precision. Redirecting auxiliary circuit flow, disabling redundant path, rebooting system. The screen went black for a second. Then, beep. And like magic, the graphs came back to life. The system restarted, fully operational, everything solved in under 30 seconds. The silence shattered into applause. Some engineers stood up, stunned. Sarah laughed through tears. Benjamin stood frozen, pale, unable to process what had just happened. Eleanor took a step back. She didn't smile. She didn't celebrate. She just took a deep breath, like someone who had finally removed a stone they'd been carrying for years. Richard walked toward her slowly. His gaze wasn't curious anymore. It was full of admiration. He extended his hand with almost ceremonial respect. "May I know your full name?" Eleanor hesitated. For a split second, she considered making one up. But something inside whispered, "It's time to be seen." Eleanor Vance. The name hung in the air like a revelation. Benjamin tried to regain control. "This doesn't prove anything." It was luck. She probably copied it from somewhere. But no one was listening anymore. Sarah turned to him, steadier than ever. "Sometimes genius comes from those who don't have to prove anything to anyone." And for the first time, Benjamin went quiet. Eleanor picked up the cloth she'd left on the floor, turned silently, and walked out of the room. Her heart pounded like a war drum inside her chest. For the first time in years, she didn't feel like a shadow. For the first time, she felt seen. But outside, leaning against her cleaning cart, she whispered to herself, "Now that they know what I can do, the world's going to try to silence me." What she didn't know was that this was just the first spark. The real storm was still on its way. The next morning, Innovatech woke up buzzing. After days of unbearable pressure, the system was stable, meetings resumed, and investors began pulling back their threats. But at the center of the storm, the name on everyone's lips wasn't Benjamin Carter, it was Eleanor Vance. Still, she showed up early, quietly, and slipped on her rubber gloves like nothing had happened. As speculation flooded the hallways, Richard Sterling personally made his way down to the maintenance floor. He found her wiping down a glass table, her eyes locked on the reflection of her tired face. "You ever think about working here in a different role?" he asked, leaning against the doorway. Eleanor didn't even glance at him. "I did, but life doesn't always let you." Her voice was soft, but carried the weight of unspoken truths. He stepped closer. "You saved the company yesterday, and I still have no idea who you really are." She stopped, looked at him, serious. "I'm someone who got tired of not being heard. So, I learned to watch." Richard nodded respectfully. "Can I listen now?" The silence between them spoke louder than any answer, but something unseen sparked there. Maybe trust, maybe fate. Benjamin, meanwhile, had locked himself in his office, his wounded pride throbbing with every move. He couldn't sleep, he couldn't eat. Being challenged by a janitor stung more than any technical loss. But there was something deeper, something he couldn't shake, an unease that didn't come from his ego, but from a growing admiration he didn't want to admit. Because deep down, he knew Eleanor had been right all along. Sarah, relieved and inspired by Eleanor's win, began following her during cleaning hours. She helped fold cloths, brought coffee, asked about equations like a student begging a master for wisdom. And little by little, Eleanor started to open up. She spoke in riddles about a past life, a garage, a brilliant father, a fall. Sarah grew more curious and started digging. What she found was shocking. In the old records from MIT's engineering department, there it was, Eleanor Vance, awarded for brilliance in applied computational intelligence, vanished after an experimental lab accident. The article described an explosion that killed 2 researchers and destroyed a revolutionary prototype. Eleanor was never seen in the academic world again, until now. Sarah read the article with her heart racing. "Oh my God, who are you?" she whispered. Meanwhile, Richard and Eleanor began crossing paths more often. He'd find her late at night, always alone, cleaning or scribbling in her notebook. And during those nights, they talked about everything, except tech. They talked about the loneliness of power, about childhood, about longing, and without realizing it, they started seeing parts of themselves in one another. 2 lonely souls pretending not to feel, just to avoid breaking. But the more Eleanor allowed herself to smile, the heavier her secrets became. Her past was still a minefield. The memories of the explosion, the screams, the guilt, still haunted her. "I'm not who you think I am," she wanted to tell Richard. But she couldn't. The fear of being rejected was stronger than the hope of being accepted. In the quiet hours before dawn, Eleanor accidentally dropped her notebook. Richard picked it up before she could. He flipped through it and saw complex technical diagrams, original formulas, notes dated years ago. He looked up at her. "You're not a janitor, Eleanor." Trembling, she replied, "I'm a survivor." And for the first time, she cried. Richard stepped forward and said softly, "You don't have to run anymore." But before she could answer, the system alarm blared again. A new failure, an unknown code, an internal breach. The calm was shattered. The threat was back. And this time it was deeply personal. The next day began like a storm, on the verge of breaking. Even though the system was stable, something was off. There were whispers in the hallways, stares that lingered too long, and one name on everyone's lips. Eleanor Vance, the woman who, in just 30 seconds, did what 15 engineers couldn't in 5 days. To some, she was a miracle. to others, a threat. Benjamin Carter no longer hid his fury. His authority had been shredded in front of the entire team, and by someone who wasn't even on the technical staff. He stomped past workstations with a glare that could cut steel. And when he spotted Sarah and Eleanor talking again in the break room, he lost it. "Teaching code now, janitor," he snapped, voice dripping with venom. The silence that followed was brutal. Eleanor turned slowly. Her face didn't show fear, but something deeper. Exhaustion. "I'm not interested in competing with you, Benjamin," he laughed, bitter. "Of course not. You already won. You've got the fame. You've got the CEO. You're acting like a star. But I know what you're doing." The room froze. Her eyes wavered. "You want my job," he hissed. "It starts with a little tip, then a miracle solution. Next thing you know, you're sitting in my chair." He stepped closer, eyes blazing. "But I'll find out who you really are. And when I do, no one will listen to you again." His words were knives, not because of the threat, but because of the truth they touched. Eleanor stepped forward, cheeks flushed, eyes brimming. "You want to know who I am, Benjamin?" she said, voice shaking. "I'm someone who lost everything over a miscalculation. Someone blamed for her own father's death. Someone who lived in fear of being brilliant ever again." Dead silence fell. Sarah covered her mouth in shock. Richard, just walking in, froze in the doorway, his heart pounding. But Eleanor stopped there. The ground felt like it had disappeared beneath her. She realized she'd gone too far. Her whole body trembled, from rage, from shame, from exposure. Richard rushed to her. "That's enough, Benjamin." His voice held command and pain. "You've crossed every line." But it was too late. The room was already full, and the rumors were lit. "Of course the CEO's defending the janitor again," someone muttered in the back. "Getting a little too convenient, don't you think?" And right there, in the middle of judging stares and barely hidden suspicion, the spark became a fire. Richard's leadership was in question. Eleanor's reputation became a target. And Benjamin savored the chaos he'd created. Eleanor ran down the hall. The walls seemed to close in. The lights too bright. The air too heavy. She raced up the stairs to the rooftop, like her own mind was pushing her. And when she got there, the sky broke open. Rain poured down, soaking her face, her hair, her shoulders. But she didn't care. She was done hiding her tears. Let them fall with the storm. Richard followed but stopped when he saw her curled up by the edge, hugging her knees. He didn't know what to say. He had never seen someone so strong, look so fragile, so he just sat beside her. "You don't have to explain anything right now," he said gently. "Just breathe. I'm here." Eleanor closed her eyes, chest rising and falling. "Maybe I should have never opened my mouth." Richard turned to her. "You changed everything. You saved everything. And if that makes the weak uncomfortable, it's because you're bigger than them." She looked at him, her eyes full of water. "You only say that because you don't know what I've done." He took her hand firmly. "Then tell me, when you're ready, not to justify yourself, but to be free." And there, under the rain, beside someone who didn't see her as a threat or a victim, Eleanor felt something new. It wasn't love yet. It was rarer. Permission. Permission to be who she really was, even in pieces. By the time Eleanor came back to herself, the rooftop was still wet. The rain had stopped, but her body was still curled up as if battling ghosts in her mind. Richard sat beside her, saying nothing. He understood. Sometimes pain doesn't need advice, just presence. And in that quiet, something between them solidified, trust, without pressure. The next day, Eleanor didn't show up. For the first time in months, her uniform hung untouched on the locker room chair. Worried, Sarah went to HR, but no one knew anything. She didn't call, didn't request time off. She just disappeared. Richard overheard in the hallway, and his chest tightened. That silence said more than words ever could. Eleanor was facing something. alone. The truth was, Eleanor had driven back to the countryside, back to the town where everything began and ended. She parked the borrowed car in front of the small cemetery. In her hands, a bouquet of wilted sunflowers. In her chest, a storm of guilt. She stopped in front of a simple grave, marked by two worn plaques, Jacob Vance and Louisa Vance, her parents, her heart, her trauma. She knelt, breathing hard. "Dad, I ruined everything, didn't I?" Her voice was fragile, unfamiliar even to herself. "If I hadn't pushed for that test, if I hadn't changed those parameters—" The words came out in sobs, like shards of a long-delayed explosion. "You believed in me so much, and I destroyed everything." For a long moment, the only sound was the wind rustling the trees. Then Eleanor reached into her pocket and pulled out a rusted circuit piece. "Remember this? You used to say I could see what no one else could. I want to believe that again." Back at Innovatech, Sarah gathered some of the team. "Eleanor didn't disappear because she's weak. She disappeared because she's bleeding on the inside. And if she doesn't come back, we're not just losing a brilliant mind. We're losing a soul." She told them about Eleanor's past, the accident, the life she tried to bury. Slowly, the hardened faces began to soften. Benjamin, silent in the back, heard it all. And something inside him began to crack. It wasn't just guilt. It was recognition. He too had lost someone because of his own arrogance. And he'd never had the courage to admit it. When the meeting ended, he stayed seated, alone, for the first time letting the shame in, maybe as a path to redemption. The next morning, Eleanor returned. Her hair still damp from the road, her eyes tired, but alive. Sarah ran to her and hugged her tight. "You came back." Eleanor gave a faint smile. "Not whole, but I'm here." The reunion was short because almost instantly a new emergency broke out. The rebooted system started failing again. Different spots, no pattern, no logic, a new error, a real threat. Richard called an emergency meeting. Either this is a leftover glitch or something worse. Eleanor stared at the screens. Something was wrong, not in the code, in the execution sequence. It's like someone's testing the system's stability from the inside. She bit her lip. Maybe it was never just a glitch. Maybe it was sabotage all along. Tension returned to the room, but this time something had changed. Eleanor wasn't alone anymore. Sarah stood with her. A few engineers leaned in, listening closely. Even Benjamin, quiet, nodded. The room no longer saw a janitor. It saw an engineer, a leader, a woman who fell, but never broke. Eleanor took a deep breath, looked at Richard and said, "If I'm going to face this, it'll be with everything I am. No more hiding." He nodded. "Then let's go. Together." The battle was just beginning again. But this time, Eleanor had something she'd never had before, a team and faith in herself. That morning, Innovatech looked more like a crisis center than a tech company. Internal alarms were flashing, systems were stuck in loops, and failure notifications multiplied like a digital virus. The relief from the day before had vanished, replaced by panic. Something serious had happened, and this time it felt personal. Sarah was the first to notice the anomaly. These commands, they're not random. Someone's forcing a breach. Eyes darted around in fear. Benjamin stepped up to the security panel, his fingers trembling. The access log shows an external entry 5 minutes ago, but the ID used is... He stopped, stunned. "It's Eleanor's badge." Dead silence swept the room. Everyone turned toward her. She stood beside Richard, confused. I didn't touch anything. I swear." Richard's expression hardened, protective. "Check the source. It could have been spoofed." But the data didn't lie. The ID code was hers, And to make it worse, a security recording showed someone in a janitor's uniform accessing the server late at night. "This can't be happening," Eleanor whispered, her voice cracking. The floor felt like it was disappearing beneath her. Sarah rushed to defend her. "This is a setup. She was out of town. I saw her." But the evidence screamed the opposite. Encrypted emails were uncovered, suggesting data was being leaked to Innovatech's biggest competitor. And they all pointed here to her. Richard stood torn, his face like stone. "I need the truth, Eleanor." She looked at him, devastated. You think I did this too?" His eyes didn't answer, and in that silence, her past swallowed her whole. Eleanor took a shaky breath and finally spoke, her voice steady with nothing left to hide. "Yes, I was a prodigy. Yes, there was an explosion. But what no one knows is that it was sabotage. Someone wanted the prototype, and they killed my parents for it. I ran, I hid, until now." The room froze. The woman everyone had just accused had been the victim of a conspiracy years ago, but there was no time to react, because just then a new alert popped up on the screen. "File transferred successfully. Origin, benjamin.innovatech.com. Everyone froze. Benjamin went pale. "That's impossible. Someone's using my ID." Sarah stared at the panel. "No, they're not using it. They built this trap from a vulnerability you left in the system. Benjamin, someone used you, just like they used Eleanor years ago." The truth started to crack the surface, like a time bomb counting down, and at the center of it was Daniel Park, a senior engineer, quiet, methodical, and now sweating bullets. "Enough!" Eleanor stepped toward him. "You always knew my story. You were there, at that company. You knew how to find me, and you tried to take me down again." Daniel backed away, but it was too late. The cameras were already rolling. The logs were already exposed. The mask had fallen. Security escorted him out, protesting the whole way, eyes locked on Eleanor like she was his mistake. The mistake that survived. Richard turned to her, guilt in his eyes. "I'm sorry I doubted you." But Eleanor didn't reply. She walked over to the whiteboard, slashed through the latest equation with authority, and said, "Trust isn't requested. It's earned." She didn't shout, but her voice thundered. Alone in the locker room later, she splashed water on her face and stared into the mirror. "Once again, I had to prove who I am. But this time, I won't ask for permission to exist." The reflection smiled back, for the first time, without fear. It was nearly dawn when the new alert echoed through Innovatech. The once stable system began collapsing again, a digital self-destruct protocol hidden deep in the code, a last resort trap left by the saboteur. The clock was ticking. If the sequence wasn't neutralized in 24 hours, Innovatech would lose all its data, and with it, its reputation around the world. Richard gathered the team, his face tense, tie loosened, eyes locked on Eleanor. "You're the only one who understands the architecture of this code. If you're willing, this team is yours. We'll follow your lead." Eleanor stood in silence. The room waited, hearts pounding, and she felt the ground tremble. That same fear, the same cold rush from before the explosion. But then, something shifted. She looked at Sarah, steady, confident, standing beside her. She looked at Benjamin, silent, eyes lowered in quiet respect. And finally, she looked at Richard, and she knew. She didn't have to prove herself anymore. She just had to do what she was born to do. "All right," she said, breathing deep. "Let's save this company, together." The room transformed into a war room. Screens lit up. Coffee was poured in silence. Keyboards clacked like an orchestra under command. Eleanor took the lead, assigning roles, rewriting code, tracking algorithms like footprints in the snow. Every move was sharp, every call fearless. She was no longer the invisible janitor. She was the captain in the heart of the storm, Benjamin managed module integrity checks. Sarah tracked hidden commands. Richard handled investor communication, buying them time. Hours passed like seconds. Each fixed bug revealed another. It was like defusing a bomb, with the timer ticking down and hope hanging by a thread. At 4 a.m., their eyes were bloodshot, bodies drained, but no one stopped. Eleanor kept her voice firm. "There's one last loop, a ghost command. It's buried in the main server's backup. If we don't find it, everything's gone in 47 minutes. Panic crept in, but she cut through it. Breathe. Confidence is the first line of code. In the final minute, Eleanor had a flash. She remembered something her father always said when problems felt impossible. The error is never where everyone's looking. It's where no one dares to look. So she stepped back, closed her eyes, ignored the screen, ignored the data, and listened to the pattern, the silence between commands, the gut instinct. She opened a forgotten folder, created before the original breach, a trace, a blind spot. Inside it, the virus, a hidden code camouflaged inside old log fragments. With trembling hands and held breath, Eleanor typed the neutralization sequence. The screen went black, the room froze. They all looked at each other, and then a green light blinked on. System stabilized. The collective sigh turned into applause. Relief, disbelief, emotion. Sarah dropped to the floor, laughing and crying at once. Benjamin discreetly wiped his eyes. Richard just looked at Eleanor in silence. There was so much in that look: gratitude, respect, awe, love. But he didn't say a word, not yet. Eleanor leaned against the wall, breath shaking. Every muscle ached, but inside, she was finally at peace. She had done it, not just saved the company, but conquered herself. The next morning arrived with a sky brushed in soft orange. It was as if even the city had paused for a moment to breathe with Eleanor. The chaos was over. Innovatech had been saved, but her heart still held unresolved pieces. It was time to close an old chapter and free herself from the weight she'd carried since the explosion that changed everything. That afternoon, Eleanor returned to the cemetery. She was different now. Back straight, eyes steady. She carried an envelope and a key. Sitting before her parents' grave, she stayed quiet for a few long minutes. Then she pulled the envelope from her pocket. Inside was the blueprint for the original project they had designed together, the one that never got finished. "I thought about tearing this up so many times, but now I know. Dreaming wasn't the mistake. Giving up on myself was." Her tears weren't frantic, they were soft, freeing. "I forgive you for leaving too soon, and I forgive myself for hiding ever since." She buried the blueprint beside the grave, like planting a seed of reconciliation, and left the key to the workshop. "Now, I leave it here." She stood, lighter, for the first time in years. Her past no longer held her back. Back in the city, Benjamin was waiting in the company's lobby, hands in his pockets, eyes on the floor. When Eleanor appeared, he looked up and held out a small box. "This isn't an apology, it's acknowledgement." Inside was an adapter, built from one of her ideas, a tribute. "You showed me that humility is the harder version of genius." Eleanor smiled, touched. "Thank you. And I hope you'll show that to others too." In the days that followed, Benjamin began mentoring young engineers again, with renewed purpose. Sarah got promoted, and Eleanor received an unexpected invitation. Richard asked her to meet on the rooftop at sunset, the same one where she had cried just days before. "The board wants you to lead our innovation department," he said, "but only if you want to." Then he paused, his eyes on the horizon. "And there's something else I'd like to offer. Something that doesn't come with a badge." Eleanor looked at him, surprised. "My heart," he said finally, "not because you're brilliant, but because of who you are when no one's watching." She didn't answer right away. The wind played with her hair. You know what scared me most about being seen, Richard? That no one would see who I really was. But you did, even when I couldn't. They moved closer. The hug was quiet, tender. No promises, just presence, just now. And that was enough. Days later, Eleanor was introduced as Innovatech's new Director of Development. But she had one condition. I want to start a program for people like I used to be. Invisible. Because talent doesn't wear a badge or a last name. And sometimes it's sweeping the floor beneath your feet. The audience rose in applause.